Okay, I am going to go ahead and get started. I'm John Haig. I am the co-director of the Mosavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. My co-director is Larry Summers. And we have these seminars on a semi-regular basis. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us Jesse Norman. And just a little bit of background about Jesse. Jesse's been an MP for Hereford and South Herefordshire, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing that horribly. But since 2010, he's had a number of roles within the government. He has served as a financial secretary to the Treasury and Paymaster General of the UK government, among other ministerial positions. He was a backbencher who was a member of the Treasury Select Committee from 2010 to 2015, chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee, 2016-17. He was made a Privy Councillor in 2019. And so obviously he is heavily immersed in British politics. Before getting into politics, but he does have a private sector background as well. He was a director at Barclays. He has researched and taught philosophy at the University of College London, and he's run a charitable profit project in communist Eastern Europe, among other things. He has a degree in classics from Oxford University and a philosophy from the University College London, an MPhil and a PhD, which is where he does some teaching now. And he's got a number of various fellowships. He was a visiting fellow at All Souls College in Oxford, 2016 to 17. And then he's been the author of a number of books and pamphlets. The first I'll mention is Compassionate Conservatism, Edmund Burke, politician, philosopher, prophet, and particularly important for today's discussion, he wrote a book, Adam Smith, What He Thought and Why It Matters, which won the Parliamentary Book Awards in 2018. And the topic today with Jesse is really From Tech Markets to Virtue Signaling, How Adam Smith Explains the Modern World. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jesse. The floor is yours, Jesse.
Well, thank you very much indeed, John. And please extend my thanks to the Institute and to Larry for your kindness in welcoming me here today. And I only wish that the circumstances were such that I could be with you all in a seminar room at the K School talking about these issues, because yours is an institution I've long admired, and obviously Harvard I know very well. And my beloved wife was at the business school over the road. We didn't talk about them, the river, but for a couple of years. So, and I used to live in Somerville in Cambridge, Mass. So it's a part of the world I know and love very much. So thank you for that. Yes, so today, if I may, I'm going to talk about Adam Smith, and we'll talk a little bit about the 18th century and some of his ideas, but I also want, knowing what a policy focus you have in the Kennedy School, I also wanted to bring it forward to the present day and possibly tee up a way of thinking about what we've got at the moment in front of us in economics, political economy, but also more widely in society and culture, and how those might help us to think about policy choices. And if there's any aspect of that any of the students want to pick up, obviously I'm available. We can have a conversation about that. I'd love to do that in the Q&A that follows. As you said, John, this really follows from my book on Adam Smith, which was now 3 years there. You'll excuse a small plug. That's the American version called Father of Economics. And as you said, it was nicely reviewed and nicely welcomed, I'm pleased to say, by the folks in the Financial Times and in other reputable places around the world. And I think the reason for that was that it tried to talk not just about Smith as a human being and as a subject of a biography, but also in a little bit more depth than you might find, philosophical depth and economic depth, perhaps, about his ideas. And there's another aspect of that I'll come to in a second. And then also about the impact, why they matter now. And the British title gave the game away because it was Adam Smith, What He Thought and Why It Matters. And let me just start, if I may, by setting up a couple of what you might call broad caricature views of Adam Smith, because I think it's quite helpful to orient a conversation. And you might describe them as the right-wing view and the left-wing view, if you like. And I suppose the right-wing view is that Smith is, and I've written a kind of summary here, the founding father of the modern era, greatest of all economists and great advocate of laissez-faire, foundational ideas of the invisible hand, advocate of the freedom of individual, a staunch enemy of state intervention. So that's what you might call a kind of right-wing view. And then you might call a left-wing view, which would be that actually he's the source of this idea of market fundamentalism, homo economicus, efficient market hypothesis. We've got all this materialism sweeping the world. He's really the origin of that intellectually, and that has the effect of corrupting other human value. And, you know, I think many people have thought, and some have suggested in print, that he's really an apologist for a system that kind of embeds inequality and human selfishness. And that sets up a choice. Which way are we going to go? Are we going to, as it were, move more towards or adopt the right-wing view, or are you going to adopt the left-wing view? And no surprises, but I want to suggest, and I'm going to suggest without any vulgar delay, that Smith is actually rather different from both of these things. These are caricatures, and we have to look elsewhere if we want to get an understanding of the kind of thinker Adam Smith really was. And just to titillate the appetite a little bit, I've put down some things that he did and did not believe. He was not an advocate of self-interest. He talks about the operations of self-interest in political economy, just one part of his ideas, but he was not an advocate of self-interest as such. Indeed, he thought it had some highly corrupting aspects to it. He did not believe that rational behavior was constituted solely by the pursuit of profit. And he didn't believe that markets were a self-regulating system. He accepted the need for the state, although he thought that the state too had its own limits. There could be what we would call now state failure as well as market failure. So he wasn't anti-state, he wasn't a believer in laissez-faire, although that's sometimes thought that he was. He wasn't pro-rich, wasn't an apologist for inequality or extremes of wealth or income, and as sometimes suggested, he was a misogynist. He certainly wasn't a misogynist either. He writes very movingly about the situation of women in several of his books. So he's rather different from what we might think. But what I think is really important for this present discussion is to understand that when we think about Smith in terms of economics, and we think about it in terms of what the 18th century would have called political economy, and there are reasons for preferring that phrase to economics, we're also only thinking about a portion of his thought. There's a great iceberg of thought out there of which we only see the topmost part. And so he's also, I want to suggest, the father of social psychology as well as economics. And that's going to give us an interesting further link to the present moment and a way of thinking about what we see when we look at the world around us today. So that's Adam Smith. Let me just take a brief canter through his background. So born in 1723 in Kirkcaldy in Scotland, in the Kingdom of Fife, as it's sometimes known, famous for St Andrews golf course just up the road. Educated at local county or borough school, and then sent off to Glasgow University, which he greatly enjoyed and was taught by a very formidable figure in the Scottish Enlightenment, Francis Hutcheson. And then he went to Balliol College, Oxford, which he did not enjoy at all. He was on a Snell scholarship reserved for the young Scottish gentleman destined for the clergy. And although he was young and Scottish, he certainly didn't think of himself as destined for the clergy. And since Balliol at that time was Jacobite, that is to say, it was a supporter of the old Stuart dynasty. This is, many years after it had left power, had stepped down. James II had left in 1688. This was, we're talking 50 years, 60 years later. He was not the college was Jacobite, it was Tory, kind of believed in centralized authority and the power of the church. It was factional, no one agreed with each other. It was very bad at teaching, it was very expensive, and it detested Scotsmen. And so since Smith was Whiggish by political temperament, not a Jacobite, extremely pacific and open-minded, and rather poor and Scottish, this was not a great combination. And so he did not enjoy Balliol, I'm afraid. but he went back to Glasgow. And one of the reasons why he preferred Glasgow to Oxford, and why he thought that Oxford was such an inferior teaching institution to Glasgow, was because, and it taught him in his view, a very strong lesson, which was that in Glasgow you had to pay the professors to teach you, and therefore the professors had a direct interest in teaching the students as well and as effectively as they could, whereas at Oxford the professors were parts of endowed foundations, and they didn't have the same zealous, jealous attention to the educational welfare of their students. And so it's nice for anyone who knows Balliol, which is the bastion of left-wing thinking today, it's nice to reflect that Balliol really was the foundation of the modern idea of tuition fees in Britain. Anyway, Smith heads back to Glasgow as professor, and then more or less stays put for a while before essentially leaving to become a commissioner of customs, with one or two little breaks in between. He takes one trip abroad to France with the Duke of Buccleuch, who's the biggest landowner in Scotland at the time, 1764, and otherwise he lives a life of extreme uneventfulness. He never married, there were no children, there were no juicy sex scandals, there were no undergraduate pranks. I mean, Smith's life from that point of view is a featureless Sahara, I'm afraid. But of course, he was famously absent-minded, and there's a lovely story about him being so engrossed in conversation once that he fell into a tanner's pit, and that captures both his absent-mindedness and also his extreme intellectuality. And that's, I think, that's the engine that's driving his thought. So that's him. Now, what is this thought? Let's just touch on that. And there are two works published in his lifetime, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, and 17 years apart. But before that, he gave some lectures that were later published on rhetoric and belles lettres after his death. And he also, we have by a miracle got copies of student notes of his lectures on jurisprudence. So we can kind of assemble the overall picture of what Smith thought. And it goes very far beyond the caricatures that we associate with The Wealth of Nations. The core idea is that human beings are operating in a world with other human beings, and the human beings are social animals. And what Smith wants to do, taking over from his great mentor and friend David Hume, arguably one of the 2 or 3 greatest philosophers ever to write in the English language, what he takes over from Hume is the idea of developing a science of man. That is to say, an integrated general account of all human behavior that, as it were, spans the arts and the sciences, but is modeled intellectually and aspires to be modeled intellectually on what the great Principia Mathematica that Isaac Newton had written, which had revolutionized thinking across the world on physics and cosmology. So that's the idea. Now the question is, well, what is this science of man in Smith's hands? And the core idea is that these social beings, these humans interacting with each other, are involved in constant processes of exchange. Now, the exchange we know about, if we know anything about Smith, is the exchange of goods and services, and what you see in The Wealth of Nations is a phenomenal expansion and elaboration of that idea, the idea of specialization, the idea of the division of labor, the idea of trade as allowing people to maximize their advantages by exchanging with each other, and therefore a sense of markets as being at the center of political economy. That's his big move. What's the difference between Smith as an economist and his predecessors? The answer, Smith's the one who puts markets squarely at the center of economics, or as he would describe it, political economy. That's the big intellectual move. But that itself, that exchange of goods and services, is just one part of a wider set of processes of exchange that he thinks of human beings as being involved in. And the other areas, and the ones I want to pick out in particular, are the theory of moral sentiments, which outlines an approach which sees human beings as embedded in exchange of esteem or moral regard, a foundational work in moral and social psychology, and then these unpublished letters on rhetoric and belles lettres, which focus on the exchange of meanings in language. So you've got a consistency of approach that goes right through Smith's career from the 1750s until the 1770s and 80s, and the revisions he does to the other works, because he spends the back end of his life revising The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments and improving them. And so it's that sense of a science of man based on theories of exchange, goods and services, moral esteem, and meanings that are the intellectual powerhouse behind his overall thinking. Now, if we take his idea of exchange in relation to goods and services, famous lines from The Wealth of Nations, he says, "Nobody ever saw a dog make a fair and deliberate exchange of one bone for another with another dog. Nobody ever saw one animal by its gestures and its natural cries signify to another, this is mine, that yours. I am willing to give this for that. But man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren." And so that kind of sums up the overall view that he has. And it really means that human exchange presupposes imagination and moral norms and standards. And that what comes out of this sense of exchange and trust and human interaction is a conception of political economy rather than economics, and of course also a sense of trust and culture as being central to his overall conception. And that translates itself not into language of capitalism, which is a kind of modern idea developed in the 19th century. We think of it as the interaction between markets and agglomerations of capital, autonomous corporations and the like. You get that in America and in Britain beginning in the 1830s and 40s. So we're not talking about capitalism, we're talking about the development of commercial society. And those are two quite different ideas. With capitalism, there is a kind of sense that actually the market can operate and systems can operate, and there could be enormous inequalities generated by that. Commercial society, with its emphasis on society, is a conception of society in which everyone, in Smith's view, is a trader with everyone else. Each man is in, as it were, a merchant, as he puts it, and lives by exchanging. And that creates a presumptive equality, a social equality, as well as a broad market equality. And Smith thinks that is lifting all boats. So he doesn't have any great truck with the idea that what's in play here is a system which just allows a few people to do extremely well and leaves others very badly off, and therefore engenders inequality. So that's already moving us quite a long way away from some of the caricatures about Smith, both of the left and the right. Then if we move to the theory of moral sentiments, we think about Smith as adumbrating a theory of exchange of moral esteem or regard. He says, man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely, or to be that thing which is the natural and proper object of love. He naturally dreads not only to be hated, but to be hateful, or to be that thing which is the natural and proper object of hatred. He desires not only praise, but praiseworthiness. In other words, what he's saying is that human beings have a natural desire to earn the regard and the esteem of other human beings, and they form their own internal moral values, not, as it were, from the inside out by, as it were, divine grace, reading the Bible, the Ten Commandments, or some other source of reflection, but by interacting with each other. And all you need is a conception of social interaction and this idea of moral regard to understand that exchanging alone with a slight source of internal correction, which allows us to aim off for things that are purely idiosyncratic in our own situation. That's what generates the idea of a value. What is good, what is bad, what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, what is attractive, unattractive, vile, repugnant, marvelous, and the rest of it. And so in a way, you get this move in Smith, very modern move, from thinking about the facts of a person's interactions with each other to asking oneself, well, what norms do these facts reflect in terms of what people admire, internalizing that as becoming a set of values that then shape one's own moral behavior and conduct. So that is the very bare outlines of Smith's exchange-based approach to moral philosophy and moral psychology. Now, if we go back to political economy and ask ourselves, well, where's the payoff here? So he has a diagnosis of the economic evils that attend a market system of the kind that he so brilliantly discussed in The Wealth of Nations. And they focus on the idea of rent extraction and monopoly, or market, as it were, failure, as we would think about it now. But in many ways, they go far beyond that. So on monopolies, as the mercantile interests have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress, and rent extraction, and even to oppress the public. So this idea that somehow everything is rosy in the garden of commercial activity is not a view he has. He says the mercantile interest, that is to say, merchants gathering together, can exert oppressive market power, and that can lead to higher returns, possibly supermarket returns and extraction of what we would call rents today. Then he says, of course, another problem is what we would call now the principal agent problem. That's the problem where we pay people to act as our agents. Typically, shareholders will pay or support managers in companies, and the directors are supposed to act with the loyalty and care of their position to make sure that the managers do what the shareholders demand. This is a view canonical in American law and literature, and given a brilliant exposition in a collection by Dick Zeckhauser, now that I mention it, since we're in the Kennedy School, called Principles and Agents. And of course, Smith captures this 300 years ago, 250 years ago, by saying the managers, rather, of other people's money, that's a very canonical phrase picked up later by Louis Brandeis, cannot well be expected to watch over it with the same anxious vigilance with which the partners in a private partnership frequently watch over their own. And then the final evil I just want to touch on is what we would today call asymmetries of information and power. And there's a nice little touch moment to where he talks about it. He says he thinks about people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. So they can get together, they can share information more easily than their customers can or their employees can, and from that can come what you might call excessive market power. So that is the other economic evil. And this is a diagnosis that he has and develops very extensively in relation to what he called the mercantile system in his own time. Now, fast forward and let's compare the 18th century to the 21st century. He identifies what we would call a kind of vicious cycle, political lobbying leading to anti-competitive regulation, egregious financial returns, growing inequality, loss of public trust, and in due course that financing further lobbying, anti-competitive regulation, egregious financial returns, growing inequality, and loss of public trust. And that was exemplified at the time by the actions of the East India Company, which over a considerable period moved from being the state-sponsored trading company in India to being a vast multinational, very much involved in the exploiting of not just the people of India, but other countries, and the generation of an enormous stream of rents, and essentially a form of imperial exploitation that we are still having to reflect on and deal with the consequences of today. Fast forward to the 21st century, and I wonder whether this diagnosis strikes any chords amongst those watching this. Political lobbying leading to anti-competitive regulation, egregious financial returns, growing inequality, loss of public trust, and back to lobbying again. Does that strike any chords, I ask? And I ask the question, are there any leading technology and financial institutions with whom we might want to associate some of these ideas or some of this behavior, or industries where we might want to think in those terms? And if that's the case, are there Smithian policy responses that we can put in place that might help to cure and address some of these problems? So that's a slight provocation. I talk about these issues, and I name a few names in the book in case anyone's interested to take a look at that. But I also think we need to turn our attention to society, the other side of what he says, commercial society, the political part of political economy, if you like, and ask ourselves, what does our social modernity and our postmodernity look like today? And my question is, are we in what one might term the narcissistic phase of capitalism? And again, I'm not going to provide evidence for this, but I just ask anyone watching this whether they've come across any of the following phenomena: virtue signaling, microaggressions, individuals treating themselves as brands and obsessively focusing on those, tribalism, impatience, an erosion of the gap between the personal and political. We've just seen that in the most appalling circumstances in Britain with the murder of a colleague of mine, David Amos, doing a constituency surgery, engaging with members of the general public, his voters, his constituents. And is the counterpart of these things, virtue signaling, microaggressions, tribalism, impatience, and the rest of it, perhaps a deep yearning for virtue, a deep, possibly unsatisfied yearning for virtue? And let me just remind you that Smith says, man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. That is to say, those very patterns of competing with each other, trading esteem or moral regard, bidding for each other's good favor, are ones that we can detect in all of the phenomena that we've described, that I've set out here already. And that is what virtue signaling is. It's bidding for someone else's good favor and esteem, sometimes with genuine virtue, sometimes not. And Smith goes further. Adam Smith goes further. He insists that commercial life can itself be morally corrupting, can be morally uplifting, giving people the money, the space, the ambition, the virtues of thrift and frugality, but it can also be morally corrupting. It's a complex story. And he denounces the disposition to admire and almost to worship the rich and the powerful. Again, I ask you whether these phenomena are in any way detectable in our modern or postmodern world. So then, what are the Smithian lessons that we can start to pick up from this discussion? I've already touched on one: markets, a central political economy. That's one of the great, that is the great move he makes to the wealth of nations. But it follows in a funny way from this that the political rhetoric of free markets is actually vacuous, empty, because there are few, if any, free markets in the world. And actually, it's not the freedom as such of a market that matters, but whether it actually is capable of sustaining and engendering effective competition. It's competition that's the driver of market outcomes within the Smithian picture of political economy. All markets are different. There are no single recipes for market success. Here we get a little closer to what you might call the policy issues. So asset markets are different from haircuts and hamburger type markets. Secondary markets are different from primary markets. The market for land is different from the market for T-bills and equities and foreign exchange and baked beans and all the rest of that. So you can't make a single prescription as to what is successful about markets. You have to look, when you are making genuine policy prescriptions as opposed to wider economic generalizations, you have to look at the details of how the market actually functions and what it's trying to do. We do this the whole time in government. I was in the Treasury the last 2 years, and we spend, of course, a lot of time thinking about how markets actually function. And therefore, policy has to strike this important reflective equilibrium. That's a Rawlsian term for Harvardites, between applying a principle, working out which principle to apply, what the right policy prescription should be, and then, of course, the facts and the context, and both those sides have to play into generating the appropriate policy response. Now, if we look at some of our markets around today, we can say, I think without too much fear of controversy, that new technology and markets are curtailing crony capitalism, but they're also enabling new forms of crony capitalism. It's not hard to see emergent monopolies. It's not hard to see principal agent problems. It's not hard to see asymmetries of information and power in markets being exacerbated, worsened by the kinds of technological developments that we've seen in the last few years. But what ultimately matters for Smith, and what I want to suggest matters us now today, is trust and norms and culture. And those things which come out of the other side of Smith's thought, the theory of moral sentiments, very much the counterpart of the Wealth of Nations, but much less well known and much less well appreciated. What matters there, what comes out of that, is this sense of the centrality of trust and culture. And of course, those things themselves are being very heavily shaped. I've picked on social media, there are other things one could raise to discuss. And I think the policy question, the overarching political question, even more than a policy question, is whether there are ways in which such processes could, even in principle, be managed or even, dare one consider, possibly reversed. And on that, I hope, suitably pregnant and provocative note, I'm going to end this. And thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to you, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity that you've given me, and thanks to the Case School.
Jesse, thanks so much. That's terrific, and it obviously starts to raise a host of questions. We'll open it up to everybody. If you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A function, and I will try to relay those to Jesse. But I do have a few questions that this obviously triggers myself,
Sure.
from myself, and I'll start, and then others should feel comfortable chiming in with their questions as I go forward.
Recording in progress.
Not sure what that is, but anyhow, so, you know, it's an interesting question about, if you will, the moral dimensions of markets. And in particular, you know, when you talked about early in the talk, you talked about kind of Adam Smith describing it as a human exchange-based approach. And if you look at the characteristics of that human exchange-based approach that you listed, it was imagination, moral norms, trust, interaction, and uncertainty. And those are not things that we typically associate with the discussion of economics, markets. And then your last slide really went to kind of a description of the characteristics or Smithian lessons. And it also touched, you ended with trust and norms and cultures. What I didn't hear a discussion of was institutionally who has responsibilities for trying to address those lessons. And it naturally leads us down the path, which is under a lot of discussion these days about what's the relative role of the government in addressing these inadequacies, what's the role of society in general, and what's the role of the commercial sector, if you will, businesses and firms themselves in addressing some of these issues. And did you find anything when you were looking through the work of Adam Smith that might provide some perspective on whose responsibility is it in what form? And I'm sure it's multifaceted, but and multi-stakeholder driven, but who's responsible for what aspects of addressing this set of problems?
Well, John, that's a fabulous question. Thank you so much. And it raises a whole host of things that one wants to talk about. So the first is that, you know, one might say, well, look, hold on a second. There are plenty of markets in which it looks like this trust thing isn't really working. I can deal in the foreign exchange markets. I'm not, you know, there's no human being on the other side that I'm having a relationship with. And yet it becomes quite clear that you only have to have someone default on the other side of a foreign exchange deal to realize that actually there's a whole series of expectations about how the system's going to work. And they may be law-based, but they're also encoded moral expectations about what constitutes good behavior in markets. And one of the things that happens over time is that as people misbehave, these things become encoded in law increasingly, and some of the self-regulatory structures that markets tend to rely on get replaced by more explicit formal structures, and not always very effectively. So that's the first point. The second point, I guess, would be that when one's moving to these kinds of words, I am very deliberately using them with an awareness that I'm harking back to a tradition that, as it was, very different from what economics has become today. And in the book, I do talk a bit, in fact, quite a lot about the process by which economics is mathematized. And I do not take an aggressively hostile view to this. I mean, you get some people who say, well, it's an outrage and, you know, everything of value has been lost. And of course, actually, there were worries in the late 19th century. Alfred Marshall and people like that, you know, very, very skilled and brilliant economists, had worries about, you know, whether maths was taking over in some way and what might be lost by doing that. But of course, we know now that economics has become enormously more rigorous as a result of that. No sane person would want to expunge the mathematical from the economic today. And yet we can also rationally worry that some stuff has been missed out, and that the political economy of view captures insights and ideas that can have relevance, even if you're a fairly hardcore mathematical economist. And, you know, one needs to go back. I mean, you know, you'll know as well as I do. Amartya Sen wrote a famous article, Rational Fools. And, you know, and there are many, there's enormous literature on what the limitations of, as it were, economics might be. And there are responses within the profession and outside as to how to deal with that. But the point about responsibility is really fundamental. And it's very important to, as it were, respect the circumstances at the time. If you think about what were the institutions that were really, in the sense that we think of it, that is to say, powerful state and non-state actors. Well, we didn't have private corporations in the 1770s and 80s. The largest corporations were these chartered companies, and it was a very, very live topic of discussion in the 1770s and 80s as to whether the East India Company was appropriately governed. And it had acquired an enormous amount of wealth. It was shipping money back and forth. That money was fueling enormous purchases of land in Britain. People were then buying themselves political representation. And there were all kinds of worries that actually the system was being subverted and that money was having this disastrous effect actually domestically, but in particular in the field. And my other great hero, Edmund Burke, about whom I've written, you know, thought of himself as writing a Magna Carta in some respects for Hindustan. You know, he had a very, very morally inclusive, he and Smith, great friends, both had a rather egalitarian, morally inclusive conception of other races and other peoples. And they were very worried about the depredations that were going on at the time. And of course, there had been an enormous famine in Bengal, in part because of the way in which the East India Company had behaved. So that issue of who's in charge and who's responsible was very much front and center. And in the case of the East India Company, it was perfectly clear that the directors in charge were supposed to be responsible. And as their responsibility and their discharge of it became eroded, so the state, I'm afraid, progressively took it over in order to try to exercise some control. But Smith thinks of the state as having a qualified responsibility. He doesn't want the state interfering and bossing markets around too much because he's aware of the damage that what we would think of as state failure can engender. But he's also very aware that the state needs to underwrite social circumstances, law, and in particular private property. How do markets work? It's an evolutionary theory in Smith's view. They work by taking things, calling them, making them into private property, and then trading them and using them to capitalize investment and the rest of it. And we do this today. I mean, I was the minister who I remember introducing the space bill in the House of Commons a few years ago. That allows a private individual to designate a piece of silicon and metal which they own, and to as a satellite, and then to put it in orbit according to a recognized procedure from a UK spaceport or somewhere else, and derive a revenue from it. That wouldn't exist if the state didn't have the capacity to allow, as it would, to privilege certain things as being private property and then allow people, entrepreneurs, to develop revenues from them. So there's that. What is really interesting, I'll just wind up in a second, is that Smith does absolutely think that state intervention can be necessary and important. So he was a defender with some, I think, cavils of the Navigation Act, which required, I don't need to tell any American that, required trade with Britain to be carried on British ships. That's a massive state intervention, but he defended it on security grounds. Most interestingly, when the Air Bank, in which the Duke of Buccleuch, his great patron, was a major investor, which was an unincorporated, non-limited liability bank, went spectacularly bust in the early 1770s. Smith spent a lot of time trying to rescue the Duke's fortune, but more to the point, he wrote a brilliant analysis of it in the Wealth of Nations, in which he says, it is essentially to regulation in the state to create fire breaks between banks that stop this thing from breaking out this fire from breaking out, from becoming a general conflagration. So the question of responsibility, he very much proposes as more or less where we do now in the state and in corporations. I think he probably would say that the individual would have more responsibility. We tend to think of individuals as not really exercising responsibility, just acting as consumers. I don't think he would regard that as an accurate description of what individuals really do want or should behave.
Interesting. There's a lot more that we could dig into there. I understand there are a couple people in the room who have questions.
Hello.
Okay. Hi. So I have a question on the point you made at the end, trust, norms, and culture are what matter for Smith. How sensitive do you think Smith was to the power of markets to erode that trust? And actually, is there a sort of innocence when Smith talks about the market and its power, because he's writing the 18th century, that maybe we wouldn't have today in the 21st century?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. So it's very easy to think of Smith as, insular Scotsman who breaks out to London, goes to France once in his life, and is basically an academic in his ivory tower. And of course, he is an academic, and he's one of the first, as it were, great intellectuals to have, as it were, become so through an academic route. And the Scottish Enlightenment I haven't really talked about, but that's very much an academic enlightenment as opposed to the French Enlightenment, which, as it were, takes place through the salon and aristocracy and other sources. So you have a caricature of what you might call an ivory tower. Smith actually isn't like that. He's got a very diverse range of sources, and he's remarkably worldly for a man of such abstemious personal habits. So, for example, he talks about the human desire for trinkets of frivolous utility, our obsession with material gain, how little it profits a human being to have acquired all this stuff, and how regretful people who have done so are when they actually come to reflect on what really matters. And so he's got a very strong critique there. He's not naive about the market's power at a time when wealth and luxury were starting to become really quite popular and bourgeoisified, if you like, in Britain. He's not at all naive about their ability to become beguiling and to create a kind of materialist ethos. But what's really, I think, interesting, and I talk about this in the book, is his attitude towards the slave trade. So he's very, very aware that the slave trade is not just, as it were, in existence, but is a market and is a great social evil. And he argues against it very early on. He argues against it in the 1750s. Now, that's 25 years to 30 years before Wilberforce and Clarkson really start leading the anti-slavery movements of the 1780s. And what's so interesting is that although he's obviously morally repelled by the slave trade, he doesn't just make a moral argument. He's trying to persuade people who may not share his moral intuition. So he makes an economic argument. Now, one might agree or disagree with the economic argument, but it's quite pioneering to say, actually, these people will be so much happier and better off, and as it were, the social and economic environment in which they are miserably placed will be so much better if they were actually paid and allowed a market function to operate, and as it were, with the benefits that he thinks of naturally arising from that. Now, that's been questioned, and rightly so. But what is so interesting is he is making an argument. He's making it very early. He's making it very vigorously, and not just on moral grounds, but also on economic grounds.
Interesting. All right, it's a little hard for me to see who that is, but I see a gentleman raising his hand in the room, and the floor is all yours.
Oh, thanks so much. So as far as government or the state is concerned, was Smith more concerned with preventing monopolies or with ensuring some sort of wage that people could live upon? or with education? Where did he look most for government intervention, if in any of those areas?
Well, thanks again. Great question. I think he talks across a spread of views, if you like. So he talks about there's a very vestigial welfare state, as you may know, at the time, the poor laws, and that is, as it were, nothing like what we have today. And he recognizes that he thinks of markets as having a general capacity to lift people's wealth and income and to level social inequalities as well. But he also is aware of the power of education. And he thinks of the state as having an obligation to ensure education, including the education of women, it appears. I mean, it's not a completely clear issue, but he frets about the moral mutilations, he describes it, the mental mutilation that goes with doing very repetitive activities, as you might think are demanded by the requirement to be doing lots of things under a division of labor, so in which the job is cut up into many different parts, and different parts are done by different people repeatedly, and the benefit comes from the improvement in efficiency you get through repeated activities. So he does worry about that, and he thinks of that as an obligation that those people couldn't necessarily discharge themselves in every case, and therefore where there is a wider public obligation through the instruments of the state or of a particular local community to support people. And so I think it's a very interesting blended picture. As so often with Smith, it's very hard to say this is his view and he's got, as it were, one principle in play. He's constantly weighing different aspects and is aware of how principles that work extremely well in some contexts don't work in others, or one can over-egg the pudding, as we would say in Britain, in some different ways with a particular approach.
Okay, so I'm going to come back and dwell on a couple of the things you said earlier. First, I find it fascinating that one of the things that he focused on was not kind of markets per se or economics, but on, for example, effective competition. And that seems to be a theme that maybe these things were all discussed at one point and they just have to create problems and come back. But that's a common theme today. A lot of people dealing with competition issues, competition authorities in the EU, antitrust agencies in the US, kind of very concerned about creating effective competition with the theme of, yeah, that's essential for innovation, which is essential for growth and development. Did he speak at all about, or did he have a perspective on the importance of invention, if you will, or whatever the term is that he would have raised at that time?
Well, it's again, fabulous question, John. So he, I mean, at the moment, everything you've said is has a parallel in a way in the 18th century. But Smith's focus on effective competition, as you say, I mean, one thinks of the way in which markups in selective industries have increased in America over the last 20 to 30 years. I talk about this in the book a bit. Some of the work that the Obama White House did with Jason Furman in this area. We had Jason come over to Britain 3 or 4 years ago to do some work in this area for us on improving competition, particularly in technology markets. So that very much congruent with the picture I'm painting. There are two great lacunae, there are two great gaps in the Smithian analysis, I would say. And I think it's important. I'm not a hagiographer. I haven't come here to say everything is perfectly rosy in the Smithian world. I think it's an astonishingly powerful picture, which we haven't really fully taken the measure of, but there certainly are gaps. And two of them are technology and as it were, the way in which technology drives or feeds into and off innovation. And then the second is industrialization. I mean, there are examples of industrial organizations in the late 18th century. In Scotland, you had the famous Carron ironworks, which made a particularly lethal form of gun called the carronade. And of course, you also have the Navy. The Navy is the greatest industrial organization in the world at the time. And I would remind us all that it was a settled principle of British naval policy until the 1870s or so to have a bigger naval fleet, a bigger fighting naval fleet than the rest of the world's fleets combined. And Voltaire says at one point in the English letters that the English Navy is 3 times the size of the French Navy. It can fight in 3 different places at once at the level that the French can. And there's an astonishing story Douglas North has talked about how they financed this essentially through the Bank of England, Dutch financial practices, the 1690s. And then you get structures of interest rates in Britain that are vastly lower. You have a more credible sovereign for borrowing purposes. But what you don't, so you get lots of capital swilling around. What you don't get is enormous fixed capital investment at that time. And Smith, although some of it is around him, he doesn't really pick up on it, and he doesn't really have a theory of it. And what's really interesting is that one of his friends and kind of semi-proteges is James Watt. So you've got Watt, Bolton and Watt, you've got the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution powering away underneath him, but it isn't really something that he spends a lot of time thinking about. So I think the question is very well aimed, and it's not until the 19th century you start to get really sophisticated accounts of technology development and industrial capital formation and the rest of it.
So I understand Dan, you've got a question?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jesse. This has been a fascinating talk. I'm interested in this idea of what matters is trust and norms and culture. And I'm wondering how Adam Smith's thinking engages with a place like China, which has been tremendously successful economically over the last 30, 40 years, but where a government is deeply invested in setting norms and culture. You mentioned the trust, norms, and culture increasingly shaped by social media. Obviously, a social media environment that is very different than that in much of the West. So how do these ideas resonate with what's happening in China?
Fascinating. I mean, it's a great question. I talk a bit about China in the book, and of course, even in the last 3 years, the story has moved on significantly in China because Xi has taken on much more control, and there's been a real pushback against some of the bigger industrial multinationals and companies. So, and then you've got a whole series of other things going on. It's a great question. I think what is so fascinating about China from adopting a Smithian viewpoint. Smith, of course, is aware of China. He's got lots of respect for China as a place of scholarship and a place of trade. But I think what is really interesting from a Smithian perspective is the question, in a way, that we're all asking ourselves because we're all Smith's debtors and beneficiaries, and that is can it really be true that a system that involves so much political control can sustain a critique of democracies and markets as essentially wasteful and short-term, and then redeem it by its own policy and the effectiveness of its own bureaucracy and the longevity of its investment? And I don't think Smith has an answer to that, and I don't think we have an answer to that yet. And what is so fascinating is to reflect that is the really big question, which is that if you don't care about trust and culture and those embedded norms and liberal freedoms that sit behind Smith's view that he takes for granted and that we take for granted, are you able to run a more effective economic engine as a result? And I want to be able to say absolutely not. And even if you could, it wouldn't survive economic shock, in a way that a liberal democratic structure of markets would do. But I have to tell you, the evidence is it's getting thin on the ground, and you can lose a lot of money betting against the Chinese. People have done that for the last 30 years, and no one's made any money doing that in that period, and they may not for a long period yet to come.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. It just seems to me that this example of China is a challenge or a unresolved point in
Yes.
your descriptions of Adam Smith's thinking. So thanks for that.
I think it's massive. I think it's interestingly, I think it's a challenge for him intellectually, it's a challenge for us, and I think it's a challenge for us because we're in some respects still structured by his ideas, and we want to be structured by his ideas, even if we think that they are coming under real intellectual attack as well as practical market challenge.
Yeah, it's hard for me to resist commenting really quickly that it does raise a number of questions about the nature of government structure that's necessary to be effective in markets.
Yes.
And while China may have very strong controls within China, and Dan is more of an expert on this than I am, but they also have chosen to participate aggressively in market economies outside of China and allow companies within China to operate within a market structure. And so it's a really interesting dilemma and question. With that, we are at the witching hour. We are at 1 o'clock. And so I just want to say thank you very much to Jesse. That was terrific and fascinating. And I think we could go on for another hour, because I actually have some questions about, like, how did his class structure, the class structure of England, play into his perspective on economic systems, the distribution of wealth. But I'm going to hold off, and maybe you and I have to find some time to catch up and have that discussion at some point. But again, thank you, Jesse, so much for taking the time, and thank you for all of you who joined us for the discussion today.
That would be brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been a great delight. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.